One of the unmistakable benefits of being too spiritual for the atheists and too free-thinking for the Christians is you get really good at not caring what other people think. And this also kind of can provide you with a little bit of distance as well when you're not going along with the crowd. It can provide you with distance from religious behavior in general. And it lends itself toward observing certain religious behaviors among the general population that can go unnoticed. For example, I have never once in my life had any issue with gay people falling in love or getting married. It never occurred to the people who raised me that this was an issue, and so it was never an issue for me. It takes religion to make a child hateful, especially toward people who are different, because those differences have to be pointed out and given names. And to get a little bit more Calvinist on you, we've been traveling together for almost 9 or 10 months now. I feel a little safer here. I'll say it takes idolatry, the worship of some power or principality, to make children hateful. It takes idolatry. It takes some little deity made by human hands. Homophobia and bigotry are idolatries. Human beings are naturally empathetic creatures because human beings are born with an innate desire to build community. It's in our programming. Building community helps us feel safe. That's how we survived the savannah. And all of this gets in the way of the various powers and principalities of the world. The prophet Micah, today, as we just heard, as Meredith shared, is fighting against an unnatural desire by the people to worship violence. Specifically, the idea of redemptive violence, that violence can somehow fix us or save us. And this is showing up in the form of blood sacrifices, rather than the practice of justice, which is what God asks for. You can read the entirety of chapter 6 of the book of Micah to put it into context. The prophet Micah is reminding the people of all of the horrors of the wilderness that they experienced in their past as a community, what they witnessed during their refugee journey. My people, prophet says, remember what Balak, king of Moab, counseled, and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered, and remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal. This is supposed to evoke horrific community memories in the people. In the Hebrew Bible, the followers of God encounter horrifying things in the lands through which they traveled and immigrated. And perhaps none of the things were more gruesome than the great Moloch of the book of Leviticus. The Moloch, or the king, is depicted as a huge metal statue, sometimes as a hollow bull, and it's filled with fire at the base. And it is into this which sacrifices were thrown, often alive, including children. So wretched and disgusting was the practice of child sacrifice that when the authors of the ancient scriptures can even bring themselves to address it, it is utterly forbidden, and the people are called to drive it out from their midst by any means necessary. And yet, this terrible Moloch seems to haunt the pages of this book. It is now thought that this terrible crime against humanity was a practice that would worm its way back into the human population and into the community following periods of intense warfare. Now, it could be subdued in time by replacing human sacrifices with an animal, and then replacing the animal with offerings of crops and food and eventually incense and money. But it lingered, flaring up from time to time. And so it was that it wound its way into the cult of Jesus, even in the Christian church, in this terrible formulation around his death, read through the lens of substitutionary atonement. It's not in the Bible. It's this piece of the powers and principalities that are hungering for a living sacrifice. So they read that into the story of his death. But this is what the prophet Micah is desperately preaching against. What shall I offer the Lord? Shall I come before her with burnt offerings, with calves? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams? Or shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? No, she has told you, O mortal, what is good, to do justice and love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. The powers and principalities of the world are always hard at work. That's my Calvinism. There it is. Someone is always trying to convince us that violence can somehow save us. And the prophets of God are hard at work, helping us remember that this is a lie. Now, Jesus of Nazareth was particularly sharp at pointing this out to people, and it got the powers and principalities angry enough to murder him, which they did. The greatest idolatry, the greatest Moloch, is the unholy beast called war. Let me tell you of the Moloch of war and my belief of the deity that drives this machine. Now, I'm not a soldier, but I was raised by a soldier. And in my early 20s, I served as a medic overseas in villages and cities that were living underneath a brutal military occupation. And so I've got some experience with these things by virtue of having been raised by an army officer and working side by side with medics who served during wars. And so I got cause to concern myself with what war does to human beings. I learned about it secondhand, though. Now, during World War II, a very clever and very sinister man encountered a very big problem for the war machine. The man was Brigadier General Samuel Lyman Atwood Marshall, affectionately nicknamed General Slam on account of his initials. Right? He spent a tremendous amount of time and resources trying to uncover and study something that I think he probably could have learned just by asking the nearest 6-year-old child. Brigadier General Samuel Lyman Atwood Marshall, God help me, I'm not going to use that stupid nickname. He discovered that in the First and Second War, after interviewing these soldiers and studying these wars, that during times of intense stress under combat, and even when their own lives were in danger, he discovered that less than 25% of soldiers would fire their weapons. They wouldn't fire their weapons. During trench warfare in the First World War, it would sometimes drop as low as 15%. Only 15% of the soldiers would fire their weapons when it was time. 85% of the soldiers wouldn't shoot. In his own words, Marshall argued that even with their own lives at risk, the resistance of the average individual, quote, toward killing a fellow man, end quote, was such that he wrote, he will not take life if it is possible to turn away from that responsibility, and then at that vital point, he suddenly becomes a conscientious objector, end quote. Well, good news for the better angels of humanity, and terrible news for the Moloch of war. But thankfully for the powers and principalities, Brigadier General Samuel Lyman Atwood Marshall hatched a plan to fix this problem. He would remedy this terrible disorder, which he labeled non-firing, which I would call sanity. And he writes it was a problem of discipline, from the Latin, disciplis, same root as disciple, which means to learn. They had to make disciples out of these soldiers. And so they began by replacing the traditional bullseye target on the firing range with a silhouette cutout in the shape of a man. And he developed the now somewhat famous combat marksmanship course, which trained soldiers to use their weapons under stressful scenarios. This is the introduction of role-playing into military training, combat role-playing. I'm not going to go through all of this. If you've seen Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, you've seen what it looks like in operation. It was by the time then that American boots really hit the ground in earnest in Korea and then later in Vietnam, the military's so-called fire metrics were much higher, and soldiers wouldn't then hesitate to fire their weapons. There were two other somewhat incidental results from this diabolical research of Brigadier General Marshall. The first, and most pressing, I think, for us here in Grand Rapids, is that all of this training he developed has now managed to make its way home and established itself in our domestic police operations. This is important. When I was a boy here in this community, I remember a police officer coming to visit my little elementary school in Caledonia, Michigan. And he was this really kindly older fellow. I think he was a statey. He'd come to our school to teach us about a new thing that they were doing. It was to encourage us to wear our bicycle helmets when we were riding our bikes. This was novelty at the time. And I remember another boy in my class. I think we were in about the third grade. And the boy, we were sitting in the assembly in the cafeteria, and the boy next to me raised his hand, and he pointed at the officer's service weapon. I think they probably carried a little .38 revolver. The boy asked him, "Is that a real gun?" And this friendly officer said, "It sure is. It's my service weapon, and I have to wear it whenever I put on this police uniform. And I'm proud to say that I've been on the police force for almost 30 years, and I've never once unholstered this gun in the line of duty. Not once." And well, that was maybe 1993 or 94. Now, following 9/11, following the terrorist attacks that happened on 9/11, military combat training began to be introduced to our domestic police forces in earnest, including a police training program that is called, and I'm not making this up, Killology. This is all in order to get our cops to fire without hesitation. Same issue they had in World War I and World War II. And today, now, 20 years later, it seems like the cops will unholster their weapons between the words, "May I please," and "see your driver's license." Grand Rapids is tearing itself apart today over this. Patrick Lyoya, a new American, was killed because we've allowed our peace officers to become soldiers trained to kill. Which brings me to the second discovery that arose out of this horrific program of discipleship and service to firing weapons. Military psychologists have been studying the conditions underlying combat fatigue since the Civil War. Today, it was most recently known as post-traumatic stress disorder. And they found that PTSD actually skyrocketed in the years following the introduction of this new firing discipline. Today, this disease kills more American soldiers than combat. Do you understand? Now more American soldiers die as a result of PTSD than die in combat. How can this be? They originally thought that PTSD came from exposure to battle, and they were wrong. And now, as of 2019, medical researchers and healthcare professionals and chaplains and psychologists have begun using a new term: moral injury. They're learning that this isn't often a result of combat, but it is often a result of training for combat. According to the Clinical Psychology Review, moral injury is, quote, an injury to an individual's moral conscience and values resulting from an act of perceived moral transgression. Now, in my own professional formation, I learned about the psychospiritual effects of moral injury under Professor Rita Nakashima-Brock, who is one of the founders of the Soul Repair Center at Bright Divinity School at TCU. And Dr. Brock worked with military veterans, and she wrote about military training today. Quote, moral injury occurs when veterans struggle with a lost sense of humanity after learning to transgress deeply held moral beliefs, end quote. And so it appears that being trained to kill runs so contrary to the innate programming of human psychology that it can result in death. War is a Moloch, and preparing for war injures the soul. Violence is a great cavernous fire in the shape of a beast that appears to promise salvation, redemption, security, if only we will offer up to it our best young people. But behind it, behind this Moloch, there is, I believe, another little god sitting on a hidden throne, another prince of hell that speaks through the Moloch. This other behind the scenes, pulling the strings, is addressed quite directly and plainly by Jesus of Nazareth. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, 24, he explains directly, you cannot serve both God and Mammon. Who is Mammon, and what does he have to do with Moloch? Last week I was sitting in the archives and I was reading an old newspaper from the 1930s, the Grand Rapids Herald. And I saw an announcement that caught my attention about a great speaker who was coming to town to give a lecture at Fountain Street Church, right here in this pulpit. The papers quietly announced that a military man was coming to Fountain Street in January of 1932 by the name of Major General Smedley Butler. Now, I may be the son of an Army man who didn't have much to say about the Marine Corps, but reading the name Smedley Butler shot a rod of iron down my spine. Smedley Butler was one of the most decorated generals in American history, receiving his direct commission as a Marine second lieutenant at the age of 16 in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. By the time that he arrived, then 30 some odd years later, to speak at Fountain Street Church, he was beyond the status of a war hero. He was a national treasure. But something had begun to gnaw at his soul, and he began to speak about it here in this church. Just 2 years after he spoke here, in 1934, General Butler went public with a conspiracy that is known today as the business plot. Butler confessed publicly that powerful business interests in the United States had attempted to recruit him to lead a domestic military coup to overthrow the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then install, in his words, a fascist dictatorship. He was so disgusted by this plot that he revealed everything that he could about it to the public, to Congress, to anyone who would listen. It destroyed his career, and it changed him forever. General Butler began to speak through his understanding that this beast called war, that he'd spent his life trying to understand, this terrible Moloch that consumes with fire, that it wasn't a god, but it was a tool. War was a tool wielded by another power, another hand, another principality. That war had become a tool, in his words, of capitalism. By 1935, he was giving speeches to pacifist groups around the country. He became the spokesman for the American League Against War and Fascism, and he published his life's work, a little book with a red cover and big white letters that titled simply, "War is a Racket." It was Major General Butler's great confession. And he wrote, quote, "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service. And during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and for the bankers. I was a racketeer. I was a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers, and the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests, and Honduras for the American fruit companies. And in China, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Al Capone could only operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents." End quote. Well, we are still human beings, and we are still born knowing that war is a deep and malicious evil, a failure of politics, and a scandal. But so long as we permit mammon to sit firm behind that flaming Moloch, it will continue to summon forth adoring crowds that worship violence as redemption and war as salvation. With what shall we come before the Lord and bow ourselves before God on high? Shall we come before God with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Or shall we give our firstborn for our transgressions, and the fruit of our bodies for the sins of our soul? As we set foot tomorrow into this Memorial Day, as I set foot into Memorial Day, I will lift up my religious truth and my religious discipline, and I will teach this again to my children. I declare abolition to war. Abolition forever to the moral injuries that result from training our children for war. And I will tell the truth about war with the same courage as the prophet Micah and great men like Smedley Butler, until we have destroyed war forever. And instead, we will have learned to do justice, to love mercy and kindness and humility, because war is a fraud sold to the people for the benefit of the rich. And may God have mercy on their souls. And may those lives destroyed or lost to the great Moloch of war never be forgotten. Even if we must continue to inscribe them into the stones of the walls of our churches, may the war dead never be forgotten, lest we forget the terrible price that is asked. So may it be.